If you're here, you're going to learn how to narrow things down. As a trained family therapist with over a decade of experience, it is my job to help people figure out what's happening within their family system. It's not always alienation, but sometimes it is. So here you're going to learn what other things could actually be happening within your family dynamics. Brighter Possibilities was opened in 2013, and I am the owner and director of Brighter Possibilities. In 2013, we opened this business with the hope of helping families. We help families better than anyone, and we're designed to help your family system. We have a team of people who meet together and constantly collaborate with one another in ways that we can better serve and more efficiently serve families who are experiencing high conflict divorce. So how can you connect with us? You're going to hear topics that I touch on today that we dig into much deeper on the podcast. We will link those episodes for you, but take a second right now to pause this and go subscribe to our podcast. That will ensure you get notified when we release new episodes and remind you to go back and listen to those topics you wanted more information on. We give bits of information daily on our social media accounts. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Following us will help you day by day. This information we're sharing with you today is not intended to replace legal or personal help. However, if you find yourself requiring or needing legal help, please seek out an attorney. If you're needing professional or personal help, we would encourage you to seek out a family counselor. I want to make sure we get right to the point for you guys. If you're the type of person that's looking for empowerment, trying to understand ways to navigate your situation, getting to a place of having hope and peace again, and even understanding ways to understand the dynamics that exist within your family system, you're in the right place. So is this for you? If you have some fears related to your child becoming estranged, or possibly not being able to heal or co-parent effectively, or maybe you struggle with navigating manipulative family dynamics, maybe supporting your children through an emotional manipulation or managing your own emotional health. Maybe you're hoping for a positive relationship with your child, or even finding peace and resolution in co-parenting, or creating a stable, loving environment for your child. Then this is the place for you. So how did we get here in the first place? Most people don't understand that when there's a marriage or a marriage that dissolves, there's a grief cycle that happens. There are 5 stages of grief. I won't go all through that with you today. However, most people that go through the grief cycle end up at different phases in those stages of grief. And so as a result of that, they're trying to solve problems differently. One of the most important things to remember that a lot of times where you're stuck is because there are past hurts that exist that you haven't fully overcome, right? Or there's fear of things going to happen. So most of the time when we find ourselves stuck in these cycles, there's cyclical moment of dynamics in our families where we're not making progress, it's coming back from a place of lack of trust and a fear. Some examples might include the inability to collaborate with one another. There's a lack of co-parenting, if even co-parenting is existing at this moment. We also try to figure out how to talk to our children through all this. In most cases, what most people will say is the communication is broke down. And remember, it's one of 2 things. It's a lack of trust or inability to overcome past hurts. So what does lack of progress look like with our children? When children see the dynamics don't work, or the parents don't get along, or there's a lack of the ability of parents to work together, children have to assume roles to preserve their system. And there's 3 roles that kids play. We have gatekeepers, we have distractors, and avoiders. Brighter Possibilities has created a way to discuss family systems by using these 3 terms when we work with children. This allows us to better serve and understand what kids are really going through in those family systems. Your gatekeepers are your peacemakers. Your distractors, they're your problem makers. They're trying to distract you from one another, so you'll focus more on them. And then you have your avoiders. These are the kids that get really busy and have many other things they want to do so they can avoid the problems that exist within their family system. This is what children do and how children play out the issues that are unresolved within your family. Of the 3 dynamics, alienation being one, the other 2 would be triangulation and parentification. I'm going to speak with you right now about triangulation and what triangulation is. Just know that in all family systems, triangulation does exist. There are healthy triangles and there's unhealthy triangles. I'm going to speak to you about the unhealthy triangle. This is what we typically call the children caught in the middle. So when you hear the term children in the middle or children are caught in the middle, you're describing what we call in family therapy triangulation. So an unhealthy triangle would be two parents that don't get along, don't know how to communicate with one another, or choose not to communicate with one another, or it's unhealthy. And the child becomes the middle person in between those two dynamics. The child is the one going between the parents, having those conversations. Sometimes we as parents put our children there. We'll ask them to deliver messages for us and do different things like that. The kids have to carry that burden of the unresolved issues that exist between the parents. And so that is called triangulation. So what do you want to remember? It impacts and threatens the relationship that you have with one another and what the child has with their parents. What you want to remember in triangulation is that how you respond and how children see you do things is the best way to detriangulate systems. If you have a situation where you're having a conversation with your co-parent or not having a conversation with co-parent, you want to do your best not to put your kid in the middle of a dialogue that involves adult matters. That is the quickest way to detriangulate, is removing the children from those things. Always step back and give yourself the opportunity to slow down. Slowing down will allow you the opportunity to reflect on the situation so that you can make the best decision possible and so that your child doesn't feel caught in the middle. So let's talk about the impacts on children that are triangulated. There's emotional distress, behavioral issues, and things to consider. Children will feel an extreme sense of being overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious due to the pressures of taking sides or trying to mediate the conflicts between their parents. Children typically, behaviorally, will experience excessive worry, have things like a depressed mood, or feel stressed about the situation and act out, like aggression, defiance, or avoidance. One of the things I've noticed most with triangulation is kids will become referees. What are the things you need to consider? Triangulation will lead children to feel parentified. Parentified children is what we're going to talk about next. But triangulation can lead itself to children feeling parentified and taking on the role of a parent. Kids will then deal with things like low self-esteem, feelings like they're not good enough, blaming themselves for the parental conflict that exists. They will also find it extremely difficult in the future to form healthy relationships. I recall a time when I was working with a family, and in this particular case, all three were present: triangulation, parentification, and alienation. Since we're talking about triangulation, I'd like to give you some examples from this particular work I had done where the triangle had existed. As the parents were in their marriage and the conflict started to arise in the marriage, the child was being pulled into the conflict. And the way that this was happening is the child had a natural curiosity of what was happening in their family. What's happening with mom and dad? Why are they arguing so much? What's the issue? Most kids are naturally curious, so this child was automatically listening in. As the parents became more irate with one another, the child then jumped in to try to separate the parents from arguing, or tried to distract them by asking something like, "Can you help me with this?" or "Can you help me with that?" The problem with it was, as the child was continuing to grow up and watching these dynamics in her parents' marriage, she began to notice that she was being pulled into these conversations. The parents would ask the child, "You think I'm right when?" Or can you hear the way your other parent's talking to me? And the poor child was then beginning to have to judge who was doing the right thing, who was doing the wrong thing, and where the child's role was and how they could help the situation. This kid was truly caught in the middle. This would become an unhealthy triangle. All right, let's talk about the next one. This is parentification. This is a very common thread. It's kind of, I like to put it right in the middle. So triangulation, which happens in most families, and if the triangle is unhealthy, it can lend itself to switch into parentification. So parentification is, let me tell you what it is first. Parentification is the child taking on the role of a parent, and it comes out in two forms. There's an emotional and a physical. So when a child is parentified, the children takes on a parental form. It's almost as if the child is parenting the parent. That's the best way to describe it. The child is parenting the parent, parentification. The child takes on the parental role from an emotional or physical standpoint. Sometimes they can take on both. So what does that look like? An emotional standpoint would be, let's say one parent is really upset about the divorce, finds himself in a really depressed state. The child then becomes the caretaker for that parent. So they defend that parent, they take care of that parent. It's almost as if they're that parent's confidant. That is a level of parentification. It is highly, highly looked at as alienation. Most people see parentifying behavior as alienating behavior, and there's a confusion. When the child is the protector of one parent, that is not alienation. That is more likely to be parentification. The child is taking care of that parent. Alienation has a very different role in what it does, but they look very similar. So there's a lot of confusion around these two. All right. So to be very clear, parentification is a child taking on the parental role from an emotional or physical standpoint where they become the parent to the parent. All right, let's break down the emotional and physical side of parentification. Emotional parentification is the child taking care of the parent's emotional needs. Physical parentification is the child taking on the needs of the parent, but from a physical standpoint. Maybe they're taking on more tasks like paying bills or cleaning up. We had one child who was mowing the grass. That used to be dad's job. Dad's no longer married. So now the child takes over and does all the fixing things when things break and mowing the grass. It's almost as if you have a pseudo husband, as what people used to use that term. It's like they're treating the child as a pseudo husband or a pseudo wife. What they're really describing is the child is being parentified physically in the family system. It's not alienation, that is parentification. All right, so diving into the emotional side a little bit more. In emotional parentification, your child is taking care of your emotional needs. If you're sad, if you're distraught, if you're depressed or anxious, the child feels it's their need to take care of you. And it's not an uncommon thing kids will do. Kids love to take care of their parents, so their parents ultimately can take care of them. So emotional parentification is where the child takes on the role of parenting the parent and taking care of the parent's emotional needs. So let's go back to things you need to remember and what is important to remember in the event you find your child is parentified. You got to start with, is this really about you or the child? Always ask yourself that question in the event you might find you're parentifying your child. Find out what your needs are. Once you understand your needs, you start understanding what needs to be fulfilled within you, just ensuring that the child isn't the one responsible for fulfilling that need that you may have. Roles need to be very clear when you are the parent and you're dealing with the child. One of the most difficult things I find with parents and where they struggle most when the parentification is present is they want to go, well, it's really up to the child. It's really up to the child. But the child doesn't get to make decisions. They get to have opinions. They don't get decisions in situations like this. And so the child feels very conflicted, thinking they have a voice and the voice is being taken from them. When in actuality, the parent is the voice of the child. And so you have to make sure those roles are extremely clear. What is a parental responsibility and what is a child's responsibility? Get help if you need it. If you're not sure if your child is being parentified or you might be parentifying your child, it is important to have a third party, like a professional or a counselor, sit down with you and understand what's happening systemically to better help you take care of the child's needs in that process. One of the things I've learned to do is reframe things. Learning to say things like that are grateful or what you're thankful for. Encouragement always goes a long way. So when you're talking to your kid, it's okay to say things like, I'm so glad that you want to help me with this, but this is something I need to work through on my own so that I can take care of you, right? You have to be in a place where you're caring for the child and not reversed. Okay, so what are the impacts on your children when you're parentified? There's emotional distresses, physical symptoms, behavioral issues, and considerations that you need to take in mind. Most of the time with the emotional distress, children can feel anxious, depressed, and ashamed. They feel guilty when they can't meet others' expectations. Some of the physical symptoms you may encounter are children complaining about physical pains like headaches, stomach aches, or just not feeling good. Some of the behavioral issues that you may notice are children acting out or becoming aggressive, maybe even having trouble sleeping. Here's what to consider. Children struggle stating their needs. They can have difficulty making friends and enjoying activities with their peers. Sometimes they feel like they don't have a support system or that they can't trust the system they have. They feel compelled to offer unsolicited advice to others in hopes it will alleviate the struggles. I'm adding a slide in here for you that I think will be extremely helpful. One of the things that a lot of us wish we could do is take a look into the future. Well, I have some information for you that I think will help you kind of take a deeper dive into the future so that you can foresee what's coming when children are parentified. The reason I'm sharing this with you is I got the opportunity to train a bunch of counselors. It was a huge event. I would loved it. I couldn't wait to do this training. And I went over the roles kids play in divorce. And parentification was one of the areas of topic that we discussed, and how kids play roles when they're parentified. What I didn't expect is what happened after the training. Multiple counselors had come up to me and asked me if any of this information had been published. And I stated it hadn't been published yet. They stated that it was so helpful to them because they could see themselves when they were children growing up, and how their journey into becoming counselors and the journey and struggles they had as adults were all played out systematically when they were kids. And saying, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I was being parentified. I didn't even realize that was the biggest influence on me, on the direction I wanted to go in as a professional, as a counselor, or even as a parent in my own family. So I decided it might be extremely important for you if I could share with you in advance what happens to kids that are parentified. What types of adults do they become? So parentification, how does it show up in adults? One of the things to keep in mind is that they grow up feeling like they had to be responsible, overly responsible. They have trouble with play, letting loose. The main thing to remember is they lose their childhood. They like to feel in control because when they were kids, they couldn't control the dynamics. They'll often compliment for being such a good kid or being so responsible, or the one I hear the most, they're highly mature for their age. Those are signs that a child may be overly parentified. Parents had trouble caring for themselves and others and placed the responsibility on you. I'm skipping around here for you because I know a lot of you can read through this. However, I want to make sure to hit some of these that are highlighted to make sure that you understand how this impacts children when they become adults. Feeling like they need to be the peacemaker. This is the one that children typically don't let go of. These are the therapists that were sitting in that room. They were the peacemakers because they were children trying to help create peace within their own family systems. They always feel like their efforts aren't appreciated. They develop a high sense of empathy and an inability to more closely connect with others. To us, that sounds great. The sad part is that when this happens to them, they overly take responsibility for what happens with others, and they ultimately lose themselves in the process. Be cognizant of how parentification could be showing up in your children and how that can impact how they become an adult. Earlier, I was telling you a story about how a child was triangulated. Let me tell you how the child shifted into being parentified. When the parents ultimately divorced and the kid had been triangulated in the system, the triangulation didn't stop. The triangulation got more efficient and got more severe as the divorce continued to spread the family apart. Both parents decided to dated, and both remarried. One of the parents' marriages was having trouble again. So in this particular parent's second marriage, they started to struggle. The parent in that situation began to have a dynamic where they were really, really sad and went into a state of depression. This child began to be the caretaker for that parent. So now the child is being parentified. Now, I know the parent didn't know they were doing that to their kid or was unaware. That's usually what happens, is there's an unawareness. The parent was unaware of the pressure it was putting on the kid for that child to take care of the parent. When you're a parent and you're parentifying your children do make you feel really good. They're taking care of you. Who wouldn't feel good from that? In this particular event, the child was parenting the parent. The opposing parent, the other parent, claimed they were being alienated, that the child was being alienated from them because the child was taking care of the other parent so much. This actually was not alienation. This was parentification. And so you can see the shift from being triangulated, which didn't change, into becoming parentified as both parents continued to struggle, and this particular parent began to struggle in another marriage that they got involved in. So this child became parentified, and the other parent was claiming alienation, when in actuality, parentification was what was occurring. The hardest thing with children that are parentified is they don't like to let it go. So when a child is parentified, they don't let go of parentifying the parent and helping the parent, because the fear of if they do, they'll lose their parent. So parentification can be a very dangerous thing for children in family systems. So the last thing to keep in mind with parentification is the child's goal is to make sure that their parent is okay. Because if their parent is okay, they can be okay. Children crave the security of knowing it's going to be okay. So parentified children need their parents to get to a place of being okay. All right, folks, let's get into why you're really here. You're wanting to know, is it alienation? Let's break it down. What is alienation? Alienation is a specific type of manipulation that is done to a child to remove them or keep them from another relationship with another party. How does alienation show up in divorce? In typical cases, it would be a parent alienating the child from another parent or manipulating that child to feel a certain way about the other parent, typically as a self-serving thing for the parent who is alienating, the alienator in terms. What you have to understand is alienation, what most people claim, they claim one type. They're claiming direct, but there's actually two types of alienation. There's direct and there's indirect. So what are those? Direct is exactly what you probably think it is. It is a specific, your dad or your mom is an X, or they did this to me. How dare they do X in our marriage? Can you believe that your parent would be whatever? It's giving a negative opinion or telling them how to feel about the other parent. That's direct. What's indirect alienation? Easy way to remember indirect alienation. I don't talk bad about the parent, but every time that phone rings and the other parent's calling, I'll roll my eyes or I'll go, oh, it's your so-and-so parent again. I'll do little things like that, little behavioral things that signify to the child that I'm put out or I don't like something from the other parent or what the other parent's doing. It's a way of sharing my opinion of the other parent in a non-verbal manner. Can indirect and direct alienation happen at the same time? Absolutely. What's hard for children is children are not in an ability to understand indirect alienation. Most parents can, children cannot. What most alienated parents do is they like to train their kids that they're being alienated, or they like to tell their kids they're being indirectly alienated. And what ends up happening is the kid ends up not liking the alienated parent even more as a result of the parent trying to train them on what alienation is or trying to protect themselves from being alienated. But keep in mind, there's two types of alienation, direct and indirect. So where's this alienation coming from? How did it get there in the first place? What we've learned in all the years of doing therapy with families, especially families that deal with alienation, is that alienation comes from a place of hate and fear. So remember we said earlier that there's an unresolved past, right? And there's a lack of trust. Well, a lot of those come from a similar place. There could be some hate built in there, right? Feeling hurt that it never got resolved. And then there's fear of what could become, fear of the relationship, fear of how I'll be treated. And so what you see with alienating people is high levels of control. What is a high level of control? A high level of control is a signal to me that there's a high level of fear. You cannot take fear from someone. You can't get rid of fear for people, but you can increase confidence. Most people try to understand, how can I make someone unafraid? You can't. How can I make someone not hate me? You can't. You can't make someone not hate you, but you can increase the confidence that person has to forgive. You can increase the confidence someone has to let go of fear. Those are things you can do. So when you're being alienated or you believe alienation is present, it's coming from one of two places: hate, fear. So what are some signs to look for in the event you believe you're being alienated? A couple things to look at are the child parroting the parent. We call it parroting, right? Repeating. So the child tells a narrative just like the other parent says. When we capture parroting, we don't say it's alienation. We say it looks like alienating behavior, right? So that's one sign, is parroting another parent. Other things you might look at is the child becoming the little investigator, where they're having to look at recording another parent or giving the other parent information about the other parent's home. That is absolutely a sign of alienation. The other thing to remember is that children use things like negative tones and body language. This is that indirect way, right? So kids might take on that, that indirect way of responding to the parent as the other parent. A lot of parents will complain that the child sounds like the other parent. When we hear that, we know that there could be alienating behavior that is occurring. sometimes that does happen. There's so many pieces to this that I want to make sure we get into, but I won't have the time to do all that today. So I want to give you some specific ones that are there. So what do you need to remember in the event you believe you're being alienated? Show your children who you are. Kids believe what they experience much more than they believe what they're told. Show your children who you are. Don't tell them, show them. Be consistent. When you're consistent, you create security for children. Kids crave security. Kids crave love. Love looks like time, and security looks like consistency. Be consistent with your kids. That's how they know what to believe and what to trust. Always, always be mindful of your nonverbals. Your nonverbal cues that you give to your children have a huge influence on what they believe and what they feel is happening. Your nonverbals are extremely important. If you tell your child you love them, but you never show up to their games, what does that look like? If you always show up to the games, but you never tell them you love them, they'll still consider that you love them. But what if you do both? What if you say, I love you, and you show up? That is a huge way to counter certain things that when you think you're being alienated. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Show up. Alrighty, so let's look at this for a second. What are the impacts on children that are alienated? Children will fear things like anger. They will feel fear. They feel sadness and confusion due to being forced to choose a side or reject a parent that they may love. They experience high levels of angst and depressive natures due to the constant stress and emotional turmoil that exist within them. So what are the behavioral issues these kids go through? They exhibit things like acting out, such as trying to cope with the emotional pain they struggle. So you might see this come out in school. You can see it come out in their friends. You can see it play out in other systems that they're in, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. They may excel in school as a way to avoid the internal or external conflict. Children's personalities will completely change, such as a kind child will become more aggressive, or an outgoing child will become more quiet. So what are the other considerations to keep in mind? Children that are being alienated have a distorted perception. They believe the negative narratives about the alienated parent, even if they're untrue. It'll lead to a distorted perception of reality and even changing the child's narrative of what they even experienced. They have difficulty forming healthy relationships. Later in life, they'll struggle with relationships due to patterns of manipulation and distrust developed from the alienation. There's a high level of guilt and shame. They feel guilty for not being close to an alienated parent, or feel guilty towards the alienator, even if they want a relationship with the other parent who is being alienated. This is a child who can't figure out a way to be loved more than you hate the other parent. So back to our family. Let's talk about how we went from triangulation to parentification to alienation. As the parents were going through their court matters and the child was parentified, wanting to protect one of the parents' emotional makeup in the situation, the more intense the court became, the more conversations began to happen with the child with one particular parent. The child was shown every single filing that the other parent filed against the parent as a way to say, see how your parent is trying to take you away. The child began to not only want to protect the emotional needs of the other parent, but began to villainize the other parent for the things they were doing to their other parent. That became alienation. So the child was being overly inundated with information, think of triangulation, which moved in to take care of their needs when the parent went into a depressive state. Then when the parent was going through the divorce matters as a result of what happened in their marital situation, the mom began to share all the court proceedings, the filings, and everything that was happening behind closed doors so that the child would feel a negative way toward the other parent. That parent did that out of fear of losing the kid. Out of fear of losing the kid, it put the kid in a position to reject the other parent so they wouldn't lose the other one, the one who was alienating. And children get stuck in that pattern. And this is how this played out in this particular family. So we saw triangulation, parentification, alienation. I'm going to put a slide up for you that reminds you of what to do. Let's go over that really quickly. There's 3 things I want you to keep in mind in the event alienation is present. Children believe what they see much more than what they hear. Show your kids, don't tell them. Kids catch you more than they hear from you. Be consistent. Consistency is the key that develops trust with people. When you're consistent as a parent, it's a good counter to alienation. The other is to be mindful of your nonverbals. Your nonverbals are much more influential to your children than you realize. Be mindful of your own nonverbals and how a child could be picking up on what they're experiencing from you directly. If you would like to review these 3 topics again, triangulation, parentification, and alienation, we have our podcast, which is Beyond Divorce, Embracing Change, where you can hear me and my colleagues discuss more in depth on these things called the Asian series. And this discusses all 3 of these and goes into a deeper dive on helping you hear on that. If you'd like to find that, again, it's the Asian series on Beyond Divorce, Embracing Change podcast. We hope to see you there. I want to thank you all for being here. And some of you might still be thinking, so this is great information, Michael, but what do I do now? So I'm going to put a slide up for you that says, now what? Something to reflect on what to do now or what you can do now. So a couple of things you might want to consider. Start with you, know where you are, and make sure you give yourself some grace. This is a very hard thing to navigate. And if you find yourself here navigating this, I understand it is a huge struggle. You're constantly considering how you feel, what your child feels all at the same time. It's a lot to bear and it's a lot to carry. We understand that. Give yourself some grace. Try not to take anything personal. When you take things personal, you will become defensive. And when the more defensive you become, the more you feel the need to protect. And the more you protect, the more it could be construed as alienation, parentification, or triangulation in sorts. Consider seeking some help from a professional therapist. A professional therapist that has trained in family systems can be a great ally in helping you understand where you are and where you can best serve your child, and understanding almost as a coach on how to navigate systems that are very difficult to find yourself through. Be consistent, loving, and supportive toward your child, even when they exhibit negative behaviors. I always tell people it's more important to be curious than it is to be defensive. You always have a choice. You can defend or become curious. Be curious. That's the way you'll learn, and that's the way you'll be able to be more helpful as well. Try to discuss your concerns openly with the other parent, but you have to be prepared to seek intervention when the communication fails. Stop bad-mouthing the other parent to anyone who the child has a relationship with. I promise this will make things worse. I'll say that again. Stop bad-mouthing the other parent to anyone whom the child has a relationship with. This will make things worse. Be patient. Rebuilding a relationship takes time and consistent effort on your part. We're excited to have you join us. I'm excited to have this out there for you. I can't wait for you guys to put some of these things in use to help your family and to help your children.